Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back at it again to bring you our Preservation Evoker guide for Season 1 of Mythic Plus. Preservation is an excellent healer going into the War Within expansion, bringing some absurd amounts of healing output, particularly in burst healing output. They are the only healer that is leveraging these empowered abilities in Fire Breath, Dream Breath, and Spirit Bloom. The first two, your breaths, the more that you're charging up the empowered effect, the more upfront damage in the case of Fire Breath, or healing in the case of Dream Breath that they are producing. If you are just hitting a one stack empowerment very quickly, then you have a longer and more powerful damage over time effect and a longer healing over time effect in Dream Breath. Spirit Bloom, the more that you're charging up the ability, the more allies that you're going to be able to heal. And so Preservation is a very proactive healer since you have these longer empower cast times that other healers don't have. And you want to make sure that you are constantly maintaining healing over time effects in reversion onto your allies. And you can even spread it to all of your allies at once through the use of your ability in Echo. Echo is going to be your primary essence spender, your combo point spender for Preservation Evoker when you're healing in dungeons, and it allows you to, just like the name suggests, echo additional healing over time effects onto your allies. And so for the base setup for incoming healing, you want to make sure you're using your Temporal Anomaly ability, which applies echoes to all your allies in a straight line with its ball effect. And then you're hitting Reversion, which is then consuming that echo effect and then placing a less strength or a weaker reversion effect onto your allies. They still benefit fully from some of your passive effects that we're going to go into in this video. And so if this sounds like a lot, don't worry. While Preservation is a more challenging healer, by the end of this, it'll hopefully be as easy as liking and subscribing. Here's our standard talent tree for Pres in Mythic Plus. On the class tree side, there's quite a few options, quite a few good talents that you could also spec into if you needed to. Things like Disintegrates damage and Landslide on the top left side are solid talents, but you don't always need them. For some mechanics, you might need Sleepwalk, for example, to crowd control enemies and have them move out so that your group can skip past them. Having your cooldown reduction for your Tail Swipe or Wing Buffet are also really good options at that choice node right below your Obsidian Bulwark. Even getting cooldown reduction on your Renewing Blaze with Fire Within can be very helpful to your allies. I, by default, like taking the Deep Breath stun at the very bottom of the tree, since whenever I'm pugging, I don't know how effectively my team will take advantage of the stuns. But if you have a ton of stuns in your group, you can very easily drop that talent and grab some more crowd control elsewhere. There's a few different enrages in dungeons where you might want to get Overawe right underneath a Pressing Roar for that enrage removal, but it's nowhere near as common as having the Dragonflight dungeons with the Raging Affix on hand. So it's more of a niche pick going into the new expansion. On the spec tree side, some people prefer Dreamwalker. I do, especially being able to move while communing in the dream. But Rush of Vitality for the extra defensive strength out of Emerald Communion is also very good as well. I did see some people playing with Flow State on the far right side of the tree, where you're just getting more cooldown reduction going for your allies. This was a really interesting talent that I kind of want to keep an eye on, as playing like a really fast empowerment ability setup could be really huge in terms of its overall damage, but it did seem like a little bit more difficult to play going into the new expansion, so something to kind of keep an eye on. Lastly, you'll see differences between people running Energy Loop and Time of Need. Both, I think, are actually quite good talents. Energy Loop basically means that if you're using your Disintegrate here and there, it'll regen mana for you, and you never really feel like you're going to stress over your mana. Temporal Anomaly costs a lot of mana to use consistently and constantly, and so there's moments where even just drinking in between pulls doesn't feel too good, and so having some active mana regen is nice. Although Time of Need does produce an excellent amount of your overall healing, and so it's definitely, if you're comfortable with your mana, the better output choice. For stats for Preservation Evoker in Mythic Plus, while Mastery produces a large amount of healing, it's much less of a focus in a dungeon environment where it doesn't add to more of your damage, and so I've heard a few different numbers of people talking about haste percentage, but trying to get around 20% in terms of haste seems to be more of the consensus that I've seen, following it up with lots of crit and versatility, and basically just avoiding mastery entirely when you're playing in a dungeon environment. Preservation has some really cool hero talents for the War Within. Starting off, you have Flame Shaper, which adds an active ability to your bars. It's going to be called Engulf. And what this does is it consumes and then extends the effects of your Dream Breath. And also, when it consumes that Dream Breath uptime, it explodes for healing onto the target and for allies nearby, based off of how much of the Dream Breath uptime that you consumed. And so you're able to echo those effects again, or use our cooldown in stasis to store casts of the ability to be able to replicate those casts and use them a little bit later on. And it really heavily synergizes when groups are going to be more stacked and are able to receive the full benefits really of the burst AoE healing that Consume Flame is going to be producing. You also get a Renewing Blaze that can be cast onto an ally in Life Cinders, and while it's half strength, especially if you used it on tanks, where tanks are needing a little bit more support in this incoming expansion, it can amount to a huge amount of additional healing that you can provide. As I mentioned, Flame Shaper really likes it when your allies are going to be stacked together, which isn't always going to be the case for you in a Mythic Plus environment. And so there's times where, especially if you have a ranged group, Flame Shaper can be a little bit more work to produce good results. Chrono Warden, on the other hand, is primarily amplifying the effects of your Spirit Bloom in power ability, giving it a healing over time effect from the Chrono Warden talent tree. It also brings a lot of empowerment cooldown reduction. Some of the talents are allowing you to reduce the cooldown of your empower abilities further, and since they really are going to be your bread and butter for pushing up health pools quickly, getting more cast of it helps make the spec more forgiving. If you potentially misused an empower ability, you're going to get it back even faster thanks to the Chrono Warden hero talent tree. You also are having your Living Flame, your single target damage or healing ability, since it works for both, turning into Chrono Flame, further empowering its effects. And the hero talents are also casting additional Living Flames or Chrono Flames here onto your allies with the buff called Afterimage. On top of that, your Tip the Scales cooldown not only grants you a massive amount of haste, which decays over time, but also gives you even more cooldown reduction. So you have a number of different resources at your disposal to play faster and to be able to do better healing when players are going to be spread out all over the place. It helps the spec in a lot of ways where it can kind of be struggling, and as a result, you do want to make sure you are selecting Chrono Warden kind of as your default hero talent going into Mythic Plus. Now, let's talk about the passives. While Preservation Evoker does not have a massive amount of abilities, there's a crazy amount of passive effects that you need to be keeping in mind. So let's start it off with some of the effects in Echo. While you have two different delivery methods to apply Echo to your allies, you can use Temporal Anomaly, or you can actually just hard cast the Echo ability onto its own. So the big thing when it comes to Echo is there's a number of talents that are amplifying the strength of the effect, but needless to say, a single target, what you would call a hard cast of Echo onto an ally, is stronger than casting Temporal Anomaly and casting those echoed effects. So how do you want to best use your echoes and use your resources? Usually, Temporal Anomaly is how you're going to set up for applying Reversion to all of your allies, since we have a passive increasing all of the healing that your allies receive when they have Reversion onto them. But Temporal Anomaly is also excellent for comboing and amplifying the effects of your Empower abilities. If you are hitting any Echo effects and you're casting Dream Breath, well, then you're going to have two healing over time effects with the regular Dream Breath and the echoed version. If you are hard casting those echoes in advance for your allies using your essence and using a little bit more mana, then you're going to have a stronger Dream Breath onto all of your allies. You have the full strength Dream Breath cast as well as the echoed effects. This also is going to be working for Spirit Bloom as well, so you're going to have even more burst potential if you are putting out echoes onto your allies and then casting the Spirit Bloom, replicating those effects, and in the case of Chrono Warden, replicating those healing over time effects. Going hand in hand with Echo is Lifebind. Now, Lifebind is an enormously important ability. It is activated by Verdant Embrace, where you're jumping to your ally in order to heal them. Once you heal them, it also triggers the Lifebind buff between you and your target. Now, you can echo this effect, and you can cast echoes with Temporal Anomaly or with just hard casting them themselves, and then it applies an equivalent Lifebind effect. So if you had a full strength echo, for example, it would be a full strength Lifebind. If you had a weaker echo effect at a temporal anomaly, you would have a weaker Lifebind effect. And so what this sets up is one-to-one relationships between you and your target. So if you have, let's say, a mage and a hunter in the group, and you apply Lifebind to both of them, if you heal the mage, then it'll also heal you, but it will not heal the hunter. If you healed yourself, then it's going to heal the mage and the hunter. So when you apply Lifebind to your allies, you want to take advantage of self-healing effects, even your health stone, health pot, even using Living Flame on yourself from some of your Life Spark procs. All of these effects together to be able to burst huge healing onto your allies. The Season 4 Dragonflight tier set bonus in Life Spark has been added in as a talent in the War Within. So whenever you are casting reversions onto your allies, they have a chance to give you this Life Spark proc, giving you an instant cast Living Flame, which can be used to heal allies or to damage enemies. This often is going to be used for damage, and usually you can just kind of freely send it. But the more uncomfortable you might be in like a pug environment where you don't really know what kind of damage people are taking, this can be an excellent resource for that sort of immediate oh no button. And since it pools up to 2 charges, you don't have to feel pressured to immediately send it the second that you have it. Keep an eye on the charges, but again, it's very flexible in how you can use it. So let's get started with our general rotation. First thing you want to make sure that you're doing is keeping reversion on cooldown and keeping it rolling on your allies, especially when you are expecting incoming damage going out. Usually what I do as I get myself started is I'll immediately cast a temporal anomaly and then cast reversion onto the tank, and all of my allies that are in range of my temporal anomaly, since it aims and goes where you're facing, are going to be buffed by reversion to be able to start setting myself up to be able to heal. Then the next thing that you want to make sure that you're taking advantage of is some of those passive effects like we mentioned. And so you want to be using Verdant Embrace very frequently to make sure that you are buffing your Dream Breath effects. You want to make sure when possible that you're echoing those effects on top of them. So if you see the tank taking a little bit more damage, you can cast Echo onto them into a Verdant Embrace. And then whenever you need to have the healing over time from Dream Breath, you'll often be using the empowerment at the first level to be able to have longer healing over time effects, which synergizes with the Chrono Warden passives, which have crits extending the duration of those HOTS. As tanks in the War Within are going to need more healing than usual or on average, you want to make sure you're often having echoes cast into the tank, maintaining reversion onto them. If you are casting a reversion just after a tank takes a big hit, it is triggering your Golden Hour passive, which is producing a kind of like a mini death strike onto that target, healing them for an amount of the damage that they had previously taken. And this can really heavily carry with certain tanks, especially like Brewmaster. Before we get into the combos, by applying your reversion to your allies, you are going to get a very large amount of Essence Burst. You're really going to be getting this by casting Living Flames or by casting reversions onto your allies. And so these Essence Burst animations are giving you free casts of your Essence abilities. And from the most basic standpoint, whenever you have extra Essence Burst on hand, you want to make sure you're using hard-casted echoes onto your allies. And then, while they last a long time, you can then choose how you want to amplify these echoed effects using either Spirit Bloom for burst damage that you're fighting up against, or Dream Breath if there is steady damage, what they call rot damage, going out. Now let's start talking about the combo effects, because there are a large amount of them. Stasis is the primary combo resource that you're wanting to take advantage of. It's a 1.5-minute cooldown, and basically once you activate the ability, the next 3 helpful spells that you are casting, it doesn't include your raid cooldown and rewind, we'll talk about that, but the next 3 helpful abilities that you're casting are then stored and can be duplicated and can be cast once again. They also are going to benefit from some of your passive abilities that you are taking advantage of with things like Call of Ysera. So the most basic stasis combo that is going to be out there is you want to make sure you're using Verdant Embrace first, then casting Stasis. And so again, the next 3 abilities are going to be stored and you can cast them again. You'll then cast Temporal Anomaly. And then you can kind of choose if you wanted to cast Spirit Bloom. If there's large amounts of burst damage that's coming out, you would then max out your empowerment of Spirit Bloom. This also works really well since the Temporal Compression passive allows you to cast Empower abilities faster. This is usually my bread and butter to sort of snap back from incoming damage. casting that full strength Spirit Bloom, and then following it up with a 1-stack empowerment for Dream Breath. Then later on, when I want to activate Stasis again, I will then use Verdant Embrace first to again get that Call of Ysera effect onto me so that I have the buffed up Dream Breath. And then I will try to make sure I have Reversion onto all my allies. Then I'll unleash my Stasis later on so that I, once again, echo the effect onto my allies, cast Spirit Bloom onto all of my allies for a huge burst of healing, and then follow it up with Dream Breath's healing over time effect onto all my allies to push up health pools quickly and then to stabilize their healing effects. You, of course, can switch it around if you wanted to use Temporal Anomaly first and follow it up with Dream Breath for when there's just constant steady damage. That's totally fine as well, but those are the 3 main abilities you want to use during your stasis. While we are preferring Chrono Warden, if you were going to play Flame Shaper, you would look to use your Engulf abilities inside your stasis instead of Temporal Anomaly. Something like using Dream Breath first into either 1 or 2 engulfs, and then following it up with a Spirit Bloom. If you used both engulfs, for example, in a stasis, then you'd probably hold Spirit Bloom for some other damage down the road. When you don't have stasis on hand, you can really freely be sending your empowered abilities whenever damage is going to go out. And the most important thing is making sure that you're in a position to actually set up that healing to begin with. What that means, once again, is keeping reversions onto your allies, but also taking advantage of the excess Essence Burst or Essence resources that you might have on hand to start preemptively putting out echoed effects onto your allies. Something as simple as having reversion on everybody, echoing your allies, and then hitting a Spirit Bloom is often more than enough to push up health pools through medium or even high amounts of damage, and it makes it very easy to sort of like snap back and respond to incoming pressure. When you play Chrono Warden, you should feel very confident about sending your Empower abilities quickly and effectively, since you have so many resources in the Chrono Tree to be able to give you more cooldown reduction. For example, if you had used your Dream Breath onto your allies and you would echo that effect and you have lots of Dream Breath rolling, and you also realize you've already used Stasis, you've already used a couple different cooldowns, well, Tip the Scales is not only an excellent comeback mechanic and an oh no button that you can have, but it also, with the Chrono Warden tree, gives you haste, and it gives you huge amounts of cooldown reduction for a brief period of time. So you could potentially tip the scales, cast some echoes, and then put out a huge value Spirit Bloom, getting that massive haste benefit and the cooldown reduction that you could have on hand really makes a huge difference in being able to respond to incoming damage and sort of react without falling behind. As I mentioned before, Lifebind is an amazing passive, and if you can pair up some of the effects, for example, using Verdant Embrace just before your stasis detonates, you can also make sure you're taking advantage of Lifebind onto all of your allies in advance. So if, for example, you are going to have huge amounts of damage onto your allies, and you know it's coming, you know you're keeping your aversions out onto your allies, and you have a strong stored stasis, well, you can Temporal Anomaly, Verdant Embrace once all your allies have been echoed, apply Lifebind to all of your allies, then unleash your stasis. Of course, you're going to be putting out healing onto everybody into your group, but the healing you're doing to yourself is also transferring to your Lifebind marked allies that you can take advantage of. You can also just use Lifebind on its own as its own sort of ramp. By manually applying echoes, you have a stronger Lifebind effect, so you could manually apply echoes to all of your allies by hard casting echo, hitting a Verdant Embrace, and then activating Emerald Communion. The huge amount of self-healing that it produces is going to be able to spread huge healing to all of your allies, and it's kind of your bread and butter when it comes to what they would call a Lifebind ramp. You also can apply Verdant Embrace once again to your 5-man, and then echo and cast a 1-stack Spirit Bloom onto yourself, where that, again, self-heal effect is going to spread to everybody else that has Lifebind on you. A lot of times I try to make sure I just max out my empowerment anyway, as there are some moments where you can just have the breathing room to spread it around, but Lifebind, needless to say, is an immensely powerful ability, and when you're already casting a lot of Verdant Embrace anyway, you always want to make sure you take advantage of it whenever possible. When it comes to dealing damage as Preservation, of course, your Fire Breath you can have as a 1-stack or as a max stack Empower ability. The big difference here is going to be on the Leaping Flames passive that is activated by casting Fire Breath. The more empowerment level that you have for your Fire Breath, the more Living Flames flames that you're going to produce to cleave all your allies. Or it could be used for dealing damage. Since Living Flame can be cast on allies or enemies, what you want to make sure you do is always max stack Fire Breath when you can. Sometimes there's moments where you're not able to and you have to immediately start healing allies. That's understandable. But when you can, max stack your empowerment level of Fire Breath, and then you can start making decisions on whether you want your Leaping Flames to be used just for damage, and you just send it on the next damage opportunity that is out there, or you could even be echoing your allies, or even just allowing your Life Spark cleaves or your Life Spark procs from your talents to cast a Living Flame onto an ally. Then Leaping Flames is going to start cleaving all of your allies, and especially when you play Chrono Warden, it does an immense amount of healing. After that, if you have excess essence on hand, you can always be using it on Disintegrate, which has gotten to be pretty good damage. I do like Energy Loop with how much mana casting lots of Temporal Anomaly can consume, although the competing talent is Time of Need, and that is really strong as well. So if I feel like my mana is worse, I definitely will spec into Energy Loop and just start sending more Disintegrates. If not, then I'll usually just be leaning on casting Living Flame on enemies, and it's very mana efficient in its resource, and does very good damage. I'll often look for opportunities where, even if I'm not spec'd into the Deep Breath stun, where I can just have all of these enemies in line to be able to cleave them all down with the Deep Breath, because it does add up to a lot of damage. Depends on if your group actually has good AoE stuns. If they don't have good AoE stuns, then having the Deep Breath on hand for an extra stun effect does get very helpful. While we mentioned that you're almost always using Empower abilities and Temporal Anomaly when casting Stasis, let's talk about some of the other cooldowns you have on hand at your disposal. For one, you have some really good defenses for your entire team in abilities like Zephyr, and also the pre-rescue for your allies to activate Twin Guardian, which activates good shield on you and the ally that you end up rescuing. These are really good just defensives you can have on hand. Things like Obsidian Scales are flat defensives onto you. Renewing Blaze is watching the damage that you're taking, recognizing it, and then healing you for that effect later on. This is great if you have a lot of like rot damage coming out, and it's especially great if you're keeping in mind how to like work with that and life bind at once, because all that self-healing all gets transferred into your Lifebind targets. Rewind is one of your most powerful cooldowns you have at your disposal, and as a result, you don't really want to stack it in most cases with your Stasis or with other Empower abilities, since it's recognizing the damage that your party has taken in the last 5 seconds. It's almost always after a huge hit where you want to immediately activate this. This will give you the breathing room that you need to add some extra damage to the boss if you needed to, or to start setting up and getting yourself prepared for the next combo that you want to throw out. We mentioned Tip the Scales previously. It's a fantastic button to sort of get you out of danger, but you also want to make sure you're sort of using it rotationally and using it frequently enough to benefit from the cooldown reduction that the Chrono Warden tree gives to you. So keep in mind that while you might want to hold on to it, especially early on when you're learning the spec, as your oh no button that instantly blasts some healing when you need to, you also want to keep in mind as you get more comfortable that this is something you want to be a little bit more aggressive for, since it brings back your other Empower abilities and gives you a massive burst of haste even before you've casted your Empower ability. Also, with Time Dilation, this is an amazing cooldown on a very short CD. When it casts it onto your ally, it's starting to stagger some of the incoming damage that they are taking. This is really good to use on tanks, especially when they are just entering into a pull and don't have many resources, but it's also amazing to use onto your allies, especially if they're going to be out of range of you. Dealing with the increased range of Preservation Evoker can be incredibly annoying, and so while yes, tossing out an external onto allies can be great, and yes, using things like Rescue as well are awesome to force people into the positions, before I actually end up going into dungeons, especially when I play Pres and some challenging keys, I think things like Stone Vault or Dawnbreaker are pretty challenging. I always try to make sure I tell pugs that they should watch for like the assist ping. If you hit G, if you have the basic binds for your ping system, hitting G and then pulling down will activate the assist one. It's like the nice green flag. I always tell pugs to start looking for that if I need people to stack up for better healing, as this makes it tremendously easier to be able to keep your allies healthy and keep your allies alive. Other things that I want to make sure I'm doing is keeping an eye on which of the people are most likely to start outranging me, whether it's like a Boomkin or a Warlock or something that is consistent about it, because then I'll always look to hardcast echo effects into those allies. I might Temporal Anomaly and then hit reversions onto everybody, but then I might just hard cast an Echo onto that Warlock and then put a reversion on them. Or I might hard cast an Echo specifically on them before I end up casting my Stasis combo, or before I end up casting my Spirit Blooms or Dream Breaths, so they always are receiving those healing effects on hand. Knowing which of your allies is the most vulnerable, both from a lack of defensive positions, they might need more healing, or they're just going to stand out of range, they might miss out on some Dream Breath things, are always super important when you're going to walk into any of these dungeons. If you have a tank friend on hand who is mighty helpful and really nice, you can always sort of guide them and talk to them about how they can sort of like pull mobs back into rooms so that everyone's going to be close by. You can also make sure that how he adjusts his own positioning, if he's in an open room as you're leaving a hallway, of like pulling things to the side and pulling things to the corner so that the range isn't sitting out in the hallway and just AFK blasting. Those little things always make a really substantial difference when you're playing Preservation, and can make all the difference in the world in having an easy time healing and a not so easy time. Definitely don't be afraid to hold on to Life Spark procs, especially as you're learning, because while most of the time you're going to see people just sending them for damage, and that's great, they are also a very powerful healing tool. So don't just blast them every single second. Thanks so much for tuning in to our Preservation Evoker guide. If you're looking for some more resources, I have them linked in the description down below with some excellent websites that have helped me as I've been on my journey of learning Preservation. Huge thank you to our patrons for all their contributions to making this content possible. If you'd like to join and support as well, check them out in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.